Can everyone hear me?
No? Yeah.
No? Yes. I shall speak up. That was fantastic. Thank you. In his sonnet 73, Shakespeare has a line that reads, "Bare ruined choirs, where late the sweet birds sang." And it's claimed by some historians, I think my friend Jesse Charles for one, that the bird in question refers to the great Tudor and Jacobean composer William Byrd. I've never been entirely convinced by that, maybe, but it certainly makes reference when he talks of the bare ruined choirs, of the dissolution of the monasteries and the beginning of the enormous religious and political crises that were to mark the 16th century and were to mark the life of William Byrd in particular. So I thought it probably wise to consider the context of the times in which Byrd lived. England and Wales, let's not forget that the Tudors were a Welsh dynasty, was changed irrevocably during the 16th century. This is the English Revolution, if ever there was one, not the one that's claimed to be the English Revolution of the following century. Henry VIII, as you all know, severed England from Rome for the sake of a marriage and succession, and the consequence was the wrecking of Catholic institutions with the help of Thomas Cromwell, a malevolent genius. Though Henry died a Catholic, theologically at least, if not a Roman one. Under Edward VI, his son, the Tudor church militant, a brilliant child king, as Dermot MacCulloch has demonstrated, and under his protectors, Suffolk and Northumberland, England turned Protestant big time, unleashing a brief, austere age of Puritanism and iconoclasm, followed by the desperate tragedy of Lady Jane Grey's Mayfly-like ascendancy. And Catholicism was briefly and fervently restored under Mary, her consort Philip II of Spain, and her Cardinal Reginald Pole. And both Mary and Pole would die on the same day, and with them would die any chance of a return of Catholicism as a national creed of England. So these were short and turbulent reigns, and under Queen Elizabeth I, with hindsight, it's of course a long reign, but there was no guarantee that it would be so, and Protestantism was reinstated, but no one could tell whether this Protestant Elizabethan settlement would last or that it would prove stable. Her Catholic subjects were faced in this climate with a number of options. None of them were especially appetizing. They could convert, as many in the urban centres, particularly in London, did, and London was very much the hub of militant Protestantism. Elizabeth's relatively tolerant policy, called the Via Media, left open another option. Catholics could hold to the old religion, more or less unobtrusively or surreptitiously, especially if they were persons of some power, and many of the country's gentry followed this course. Among them was William Byrd's chief patron, Sir John Petre of Ingledston of Essex. Byrd was an Essex man. The third, and by far the most dangerous option, was to work for the restoration of a Catholic England. And Elizabeth's reign became ever more turbulent as this reversal was attempted. She faced an armed uprising of the Northern Earls. There were attempted invasions from Spain, most famously, of course, the existential threat of the Armada in 1588. And there were a series of plots to depose her by the highly advanced and very well funded schemes of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. There were seminary priests trained at Douai, which was then in the Spanish Netherlands and is now in northern France from the mid-1570s onwards. And the Jesuits, of whom there were fewer, though they were much more committed, much more dangerous, began to arrive from the English college founded in Counter-Reformation Rome. The most devout secular English Catholics returned home secretly as part of an organised mission. And this was an option that Elizabeth certainly could not leave open. And she hunted down and executed Jesuits with increasingly aggressive minds. And in this she was aided by her brilliant, calculating, some might say, paranoid Secretary of State, William Cecil, Burleigh, and the spy master, Francis Tregian, who was very much, I suppose, the font of Britain's intelligence services. Now, Byrd was a recusant, the term given to those who refused to attend Church of England services, which was required by law, and he was a determined recusant. He was once fined £200 for his intransigence on such matters, which is a really quite extraordinary sum of money for the time. And later in life, he was even accused of seducing people back to the old religion, a potentially fatal accusation. Yet Byrd was never persecuted, though clearly he must have come close, not least when his first patron, Sir Thomas Paget of the Beaudesert estate in Staffordshire, had to flee England in the wake of the Throckmorton plot. Just a brief summary of that plot. It sought an invasion of England masterminded by the fanatically anti-Protestant Duke of Guise in France, who was, of course, related closely to Elizabeth's great rival, who was then imprisoned, Mary Queen of Scots. Charles Paget, the younger brother of Thomas Paget, another of Byrd's patrons, was a major player, though Francis Throckmorton, after whom the plot is named, was a small, though still significant element. The French and Spanish ambassadors in England were implicated, as were some of the greatest families in England. Along with the Pagets, these included the Earl of Northumberland and Lord Henry Howard. Yet against this backdrop, neither Byrd's Catholic sympathies nor his Catholic activities stopped him from establishing himself, certainly by the time he was 35 or so this would be the mid-1570s, as the leading member of Queen Elizabeth's Anglican Chapel Royal, successor, one might say, to his aforementioned teacher, Thomas Tallis. This really was a golden age of English music. Byrd composed a number of works to gratify the Queen. He wrote the first English madrigal, a style imported from Italy, in her honour, this sweet and merry month of May, it was called. He also wrote an anthem to words of her own, giving thanks to the defeat of the Spanish Armada. In the same year, he wrote another anthem on the occasion of her 30th accession day. And that seems to have been for some other great state occasion too, and certainly for the Chapel Royal, he composed the grandest piece of Anglican church music ever made until that point, which is his famous The Great Service. In other words, Byrd was considered one of the supreme ornaments of Elizabeth's court, his talents established and recognised. But at the same time, one could also say, living a double life, that he was an ornament to the Jesuit enterprise to undermine the very regime he served so brilliantly. During the 1580s, the most difficult years for the recusants, the decade that witnessed the first martyrdoms of missionary priests, most famously that of Edmund Campion, the execution of Mary Queen of Scots after the unravelling of another plot, the Babington plot, and, of course, the existential crisis of the Armada. At this point in time, Byrd appears to devote himself almost exclusively to one musical genre, the Latin motet. An a cappella composition set to a Latin text, almost always sacred, a genre described by Byrd's student, another great composer, Thomas Morley, as the chiefest for art and utility. Around 1590, 2 books of Byrd's motets were published, most of them large pieces in 2 or more sections. Because they were in Latin, we can say with some confidence that Byrd's motets were not meant for church performances, but for private ones. And remarkably, around half of the texts voice laments, protests, and exhortations on behalf of the recusant community. And Byrd was actually summoned, extraordinarily, to a week-long secret gathering to welcome 2 of the most important Jesuit priests to enter the country, Robert Savile, the poet, and Henry Garnet, who became the future principal of this mission of reconversion. An extraordinarily dangerous thing to do. There's very little evidence of the music that they heard and how it was received, for obvious reasons. It's clandestine. But the Jesuit Thomas Fitzherbert wrote that the poem "Why Do I Use" was soon set forth in music by the best musician in England, which I have often seen and heard, and that's almost certainly a reference to Byrd. What is for certain is that Byrd's motets were heard at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor, and we know that from an exchange between him and the imperial kapellmeister, Philip de Monte. De Monte was in communication with Byrd, and possibly at the behest of the emperor, sent Byrd a motet with verses of the Psalms rearranged. More generally, Byrd's music circulated widely in manuscript part books used for private singing, even before it was made available in print. And this was after 1588, that crucial year, the Armada year. In addition to the evidence from the 1580s of Byrd's association with the Jesuits, there are also Jesuit leanings in his later Gradualia anthology, considered one of his greatest works. And the project, again, was probably concocted jointly with Byrd by Garnet, as a keen musician, or Savile, or others in the Jesuit mission. And the Jesuits, well organised as they were, would have seen to it that the music was circulated to where it was needed most. So the question you'll all be asking yourselves is, how on earth did he get away with it in this age of plot and paranoia? Well, I think there are 2 factors that come into play. The first is Byrd's personal connections with Elizabeth and her own attitude towards Catholics. We have to remember that at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, the majority of her subjects were still Catholic, and her religious policy was predicated through necessity on a certain level of tolerance. She showed many times a disinclination to intrude upon conscience. Many, for example, will be aware of her stated desire that she had no wish to look into men's souls. What she did demand was loyalty to the crown, and she could be remarkably loyal in return to that. The Earl of Worcester, for example, was described very publicly as a stiff papist by the Queen, but he was a good subject, and he remained one of her long-time favourites, though I can't imagine what it's like being called a stiff papist in public by Elizabeth amid that atmosphere. But among Byrd's formidable list of high-placed friends and patrons was the Earl, who was one of the closest and most powerful. He owned an impressive music library. He'd taken probably some kind of music instruction from Byrd, and he received a dedication from him and provided him with a room in his London mansion. He even complained once, this is on the record, about the Irish tunes, Irish melodies, that were then rather fashionable at the Elizabethan court. That was in 1602, just a year before the Queen's death. And Worcester hopes and writes that in winter, lullaby, an old song of Byrd will be more in request. And Elizabeth also favoured royal chapel services in what we would now consider the High Church Anglican style, a reflection of her essentially conservative religious outlook, which didn't endear her to Puritans, who were on the increase at that time, but was generally popular with the public. It also, and I think this is crucial, allowed her to impress ambassadors from rival powers who could return home with reports of these lavish displays in Latin, which Elizabeth allowed for her chapel and for the universities and public schools. I always think back to Miranda Richardson's portrait of Elizabeth in Blackadder here. You can imagine Burley coming up to her and saying, "Are you sure we should have these in Latin?" And she would reply, "Of course, who's Queen?" A rather surprised German visitor to St George's Chapel, Windsor, in 1599 wrote that in Outward's ceremonies they much resemble the Papists. And the Byrd motets, printed in his first publication, the Cantiones, of 1575, may well have been sung in the chapel royal. Of course, we'll never really know what Elizabeth thought about Byrd's music itself, but we can be certain that she understood the distinction of her chapel depended very much on his genius, and undoubtedly she thought him an asset to the nation. So convinced that Byrd was England's pride as a musician, she would have kept him in her good graces so long as, and only as long as, he stayed clear of anything she judged treasonous. He and Tallis, who was probably also of Catholic bent, received from her several leases and a license for music printing, which made them wealthy men. She even gave Byrd a remittance of some sort for his recusancy, which means he probably never had to pay that 200 fine anyway. In the early 1590s, in the wake of the Armada, recusancy laws stiffened, and many people like Byrd, recusants, withdrew. He withdrew from London and took up residence in a village called Stondon Massey in Essex, the Byrd family's ancestral home. And he was also a refuge, for Stondon was close to the country seat of Sir John Petre, his patron. And under his protection, Byrd and his family would have been able to worship at his manors more or less without disturbance. And as a composer, turning away from motets of protest and lamentation, he devoted himself more to music for the adornment of the clandestine masses that we know were celebrated widely among the English gentry and aristocracy. That Petre himself maintained priests who conducted such masses we know, because in 1581 the priest he harboured had been betrayed and executed. Byrd's new musical programme, his outlook reflected a new sense of realism and resignation on the part of many English Catholics after the defeat of the Armada. It was a turn inward, a turn away from hopes for any Catholic restoration, more towards the maintenance of an acceptance of minority status. The number of recusants shrank evermore, and the old indignation and activism gave way to the cultivation of a minority faith through its services, which lasts to this day. In 1605 and 1607, in the new reign of James I, came 2 books of gradualia, settings for tests that mark special days throughout the church year. Music for Christmas, Epiphany, Easter, Ascension, Whitsun, and certain other feasts. And Byrd, now in his mid-60s, with still almost another 20 years to live, lay down his pen. He provided his faithful with music for their essential service, the Mass, throughout the year and for all time. It also demonstrated a genius as a composer that lives on, as we just heard and will hear again, 400 years later, in a more secular age, which nevertheless we could too label a distracted time, which is much in need of his contemplative, transcendent beauty as ever. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much, Paul. That was absolutely fascinating. I learned so much, and I'm so glad, so grateful to you for that. So we're going to finish with this piece, The Bells. I've written a note about its historical nature. The other thing to be just a bit aware of is that it used the whole compass. And towards the end, you'll hear it goes from the top to the bottom of what would then have been the compass of the piano, or the keyboard, which goes from there to there, which is 3.5 octaves. Nowadays, a grand piano has 8 octaves. Keyboards gradually expanded, particularly as the early piano came in, and particularly as you had virtuosi like Scarlatti extended the range of the keyboard, as did Beethoven. This one here, which was the harpsichord was made to play most, this has 6 octaves. And so therefore it has a further octave on top of what Byrd would have known, and another half octave below. They also had another fiendish thing that they used to do, which is called a split bass. And instead of having the notes go down chromatically, you had some of the notes, what were supposed to, well, what would on a piano be white notes, were actually played by the black notes, because they didn't bother with the semitones at the bottom. So they are a particular form of treachery if you ever encounter them as a keyboard player. Anyway, so here are the bells, the earliest example of English change ringing.